Imagine waking up one morning to a chilling realization that every struggle you've faced, every ache in your body, every moment of confusion and pain can be traced back to one horrifying truth. A truth that was never your fault. Your trembling hands, your shortness of breath, your clouded thoughts. All of it the result of choices made long before you were born. Your parents, driven by an obsession with pure bloodlines, unknowingly condemned you to a life of suffering. Your mother is your cousin. Your father is your uncle. Your grandmother is also your great-aunt. The family tree doesn't branch. It twists in on itself, a vine choking on its own coils. You are not the product of love, but of a calculated breeding program meant to protect power and wealth, with no thought for the human cost. This isn't a dark work of fiction. It was reality for countless women throughout history. Women trapped in a genetic fate they never chose. Before we step into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, remember to like this video, subscribe for more, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I'm always amazed that we can explore these ancient stories together from different corners of the globe, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand these women's lives, we must first understand the twisted logic that created their pain. For centuries, European royalty believed that marrying within their own bloodline preserved their divine right to rule. They saw their so-called blue blood as sacred, blessed by God, and different from that of commoners. The practice became so ingrained that by the 16th century, the royal houses of Europe were essentially one massive web of intermarried cousins. Uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, and even siblings producing heirs who would inherit empires. What they could not understand was that they were laying the foundations for a genetic nightmare, one that would echo for generations. And no family demonstrated this more than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain. Their unofficial motto might as well have been, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." But these marriages were anything but happy. They were calculated genetic gambles that produced some of the most tragic figures in history. Our first story begins in Vienna, 1634. In the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, a child is born who will never know a day free of pain. Marie Anna of Austria enters the world carrying the Habsburg curse already written into her DNA. The product of generations of cousin marrying cousin, her family tree knotted into something more like a noose. From her earliest memories, Maria Anna knows she is different. While other children run and play, she struggles to walk. Her spine curves unnaturally, forcing her into a hunched posture that makes breathing difficult. Her jaw juts forward so severely that eating solid food is a constant battle. Servants must cut her meals into tiny pieces, yet even then, every bite is an exhausting trial of careful chewing and cautious swallowing. But her physical suffering is matched, and perhaps even overshadowed, by a deeper torment, understanding why she suffers. She grows up surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, and in each painted face she recognizes her own deformities. Here is an uncle with the same protruding jaw. There, a grandmother with the same crooked spine. With a clarity born of pain, she understands she is not unique, merely the latest victim in a long line of genetic disasters. The palace physicians, armed with nothing but bloodletting and prayers, can offer no cure. They whisper about the Habsburg curse, but never in her presence. To her face, they speak of mysterious illnesses and God's will, never daring to say aloud what everyone knows, that her suffering is the direct result of her family's relentless obsession with bloodline purity. Maria Anna spends her life in dimly lit rooms, curtains drawn to shield her from the world, and the world from her. She devours books, her mind one of the few parts of her body unbroken. In stories, she discovers worlds where love matters more than lineage, where children are not born bearing the sins of their ancestors in their bones. But reality always pulls her back. Court physicians examine her often, documenting her deformities with cold precision, measuring the curve of her spine, the angle of her jaw, the weakness in her limbs. She is no longer seen as a person, but as a living specimen of what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves. Her loneliness is perhaps the cruelest pain. Suitors, all of them also cousins, recoil at the sight of her. Marriage negotiations dissolve almost as soon as they begin. Even in a world where cousin marriage is routine, her condition is considered too extreme to ignore. Maria Anna dies at the age of 32, her body finally giving in to the slow, relentless toll of generations of genetic damage. Her death certificate listed a series of ailments, but the true cause was never written. Maria Anna died because generations of her ancestors had chosen power over humanity, purity over compassion. From Austria, our path now turns to Spain, to perhaps the most tragic figure in this tangled web, Joanna of Castile, remembered by history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and financed Columbus's voyages, Joanna seemed destined for greatness. Instead, her life became a haunting warning about the price of keeping bloodlines pure. In her youth, there was no sign of madness. She was intelligent, well-educated, fluent in several languages. But the seeds of her undoing had already been planted deep within her bloodline. Her parents were cousins, part of the same tightly woven network of European royalty that had been marrying itself for centuries. The first cracks appeared after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a political union forged to strengthen alliances. But behind the facade, it became a battlefield. Philip was unfaithful, cold, and manipulative. Joanna's love for him burned with an intensity others saw as unstable. But was it truly madness? Or was it the desperate devotion of a woman trapped in an impossible role? Joanna had been raised to believe marriage was her highest duty, that producing heirs was her sacred calling. When her marriage became a source of humiliation and betrayal, her mind began to splinter under the weight. The true tragedy began in 1506 when Philip died suddenly. Joanna's grief deepened into something darker, something obsessive. She refused to bury him, traveling across Spain with his coffin, opening it again and again to kiss his decaying body. The image is disturbing, but it reveals a deeper truth. Joanna had been so starved of real human connection that even death could not break her attachment to the one person who had ever shown her attention, however cruel that attention had been. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, used her so-called madness as a political weapon, the perfect justification to strip her of power. Joanna spent the last 46 years of her life imprisoned in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions were appalling. She was kept in dark, freezing rooms, fed just enough to survive, denied even the most basic hygiene. Attendants reported that she could go weeks without washing, that she tore her clothes to rags, that she screamed for hours at a time. But again, the question lingers. Was she truly mad, or driven to the edge by relentless isolation and abuse? Modern historians increasingly suspect the latter, that her madness was as much political invention as medical reality. Her behavior, while extreme, mirrors the symptoms of deep depression, crippling anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, all worsened by decades of confinement. The genetic shadow cannot be ignored. Joanna's family tree is riddled with mental illness, depression, and anxiety, patterns that became sharper, more devastating, with every generation of inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had suffered similar episodes. Her daughter, Catherine, would later show signs of severe depression. Joanna died in 1555, still locked away, still officially mad. Her passing barely stirred a ripple. She had been erased long before, dismissed as an inconvenient lunatic instead of recognized as what she truly was, a victim of a system that prized politics over humanity. Our next story unfolds in the gilded halls of the Spanish court, where a little girl named Margaret Teresa carried the weight of an empire in her fragile body. Born in 1651, she was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Marie Antoinette of Austria. Yes, his niece. By this time, the Habsburg dynasty was so entangled that uncles marrying their brothers' daughters was considered entirely unremarkable. Margaret Teresa's life is unusually well documented, thanks to the paintings of Diego Velázquez, court painter to the Spanish kings. In these masterpieces, we see a child who should have been playing with toys and chasing sunlight, instead posed in stiff, elaborate gowns of royal protocol. Look closely, and you'll see what Velasquez, ever diplomatic, could not completely conceal. A jaw that protrudes just slightly, foreshadowing the severe deformities to come. Eyes with a distant, almost vacant quality, hints of developmental delays. A posture that, even in youth, suggests the spinal troubles that haunted her bloodline. But the tragedy of Margaret Theresa was not only written in her body. It lay in her total lack of control over her own life. From birth, every decision about her future was made by men who saw her not as a child, but as a pawn on the chessboard of European politics. When she was still a toddler, she was promised in marriage to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. Across Europe, the engagement was celebrated as a brilliant diplomatic triumph, with no one stopping to consider what it meant for the little girl at its center. Margaret Theresa grew up knowing her sole purpose: to marry her uncle and produce heirs to continue the Habsburg line. She was given the finest education available to a woman of her rank, learning languages, music, dance, and painting. But each accomplishment was nothing more than another ornament to present to her future husband, who was also her blood relative. The marriage takes place in 1666. Margaret Theresa is just 15 years old. Leopold is 26, old enough to be her father. And, more disturbingly, he is literally her father's brother. The wedding is celebrated with lavish ceremonies and grand public festivities, but for Margaret Theresa, it marks the end of whatever childhood she had left. The physical reality of her marriage is something court records only hint at, never fully describing. From the moment she weds, she is expected to bear children, immediately, despite her fragile health and tender age. The pressure is immense. The survival of the Habsburg dynasty rests squarely on her ability to produce healthy heirs. She becomes pregnant multiple times, but tragedy follows each attempt. Her first child, a daughter, lives only a few months. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage. When she finally gives birth to a son who survives infancy, relief sweeps through the court, only for it to be shattered when it becomes clear the boy has inherited the full range of Habsburg genetic afflictions. Margaret Theresa herself grows weaker with each pregnancy. The combined weight of hereditary health problems and the physical strain of repeated childbirth slowly breaks her body. Modern doctors would likely recognize her symptoms as severe anemia, chronic respiratory illness, and possibly epilepsy. Court physicians record her decline in chillingly clinical detail: her slurred speech, her frequent seizures, her inability to keep food down. Yet they never name the obvious cause: the generations of inbreeding that had poisoned her bloodline. In 1673, just 6 years after her wedding, Margaret Theresa dies at the age of 21. Officially, the cause is listed as fever, but in truth, her body simply gave out under the crushing weight of genetic damage and physical trauma. Across the empire, her death is mourned, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers grieve the loss of a potential source of heirs, not the loss of a young woman whose life had been sacrificed to protect a dynasty already rotting from within. Our journey now takes us to the glittering halls of Versailles, a palace of dazzling ceremony and towering ambition, where a Spanish princess named Anna of Austria bears the hidden weight of her Habsburg heritage. Born in 1601, Anna is the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another uncle-niece union, celebrated among Europe's royal elite as a desirable match. Her early years in Madrid follow a familiar pattern for the children of such unions. She develops slowly, showing the characteristic learning difficulties that plagued many Habsburg descendants. Her jaw juts forward, making speech awkward and eating exhausting. And perhaps most tragically, she displays the hallmarks of what modern medicine would recognize as severe anxiety and depression. In 1615, at just 14 years old, Anna is married to Louis XIII of France as part of a carefully crafted diplomatic arrangement. The marriage is intended to cement peace between Spain and France, two powers long locked in war. No one pauses to consider the emotional impact on Anna herself. She is torn from her homeland, thrust into a foreign court, expected to master a new language, adopt unfamiliar customs, and instantly fulfill her role as queen. At first, the French court welcomes her with dazzling celebrations. But the truth soon becomes painfully clear. Louis XIII is a cold, distant husband, more focused on his own struggles than on his young wife. Modern historians suspect he suffered from severe depression and possibly from a suppressed homosexuality, in a time when such feelings could never be acknowledged. Anna finds herself caught between two crushing expectations. As Queen of France, she must produce male heirs to secure the succession. As a Habsburg, she carries genetic weaknesses that make healthy childbearing almost impossible. Her first pregnancies end in miscarriage or infant death, each loss deepening her depression and anxiety. Following the medical beliefs of their time, court physicians blame Anna for these failures. They subject her to painful and humiliating treatments, repeated bloodletting, harsh purges, bizarre diets. She is examined intimately and often, the doctors searching for so-called defects in her feminine nature. No one considers the truth, that the problem lies not with her womanhood, but with the centuries of cousin marriages in her family tree. As the years pass without a surviving heir, Anna becomes a target of gossip and political scheming. Whispers spread that she is cursed, that God has turned against the Spanish alliance, that France must replace her. The pressure pushes her into what we would now call severe agoraphobia. She grows afraid to appear in public, retreating to her private apartments for days on end. Her marriage to Louis deteriorates further. They live mostly apart, meeting only when royal protocol demands it. In her loneliness, Anna turns increasingly to religion, clinging to Catholic rituals with an almost obsessive devotion. Then, after 23 years of marriage, the impossible happens. Anna gives birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. The birth is celebrated as a sign of divine favor, but for Anna, it is both a triumph and a fresh source of fear. She knows her worth in the eyes of the court rests entirely on her ability to bear more heirs. 2 years later, she delivers a second son, Philippe, securing the succession and finally easing the relentless political pressure. Yet the years of emotional strain and physical hardship have left scars that no success can erase. Anna remains deeply anxious and chronically depressed, her later life marked by digestive troubles, breathing difficulties, and what her doctors call melancholy attacks that keep her bedridden for days. Modern historians now believe she suffered from the anxiety disorders and depression that ran through Habsburg bloodlines, worsened by the trauma of her youth and marriage. Anna dies in 1666, having outlived her husband and watched her son rise to become one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. But her true legacy is not the political triumphs celebrated in history books. It is the human cost of a system that treated women as breeding stock, blind to the devastating genetic consequences of dynastic marriages. And while Marie Antoinette is remembered for her role in the French Revolution, her story, too, is deeply entwined with the Habsburg tradition of inbreeding and the suffering it left behind. Born in 1755, Marie Antoinette was the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was less consanguineous than some Habsburg unions, but the genetic consequences of centuries of intermarriage still followed her to France. When she arrived in 1770 as a 14-year-old bride, she carried not only the hopes of an Austrian-French alliance, but also the invisible burden of Habsburg inheritance. Portraits by Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun depict a graceful young queen, yet subtle signs remain. The slightly protruding lower lip, the distinctive Habsburg jawline that had grown more pronounced with each generation. Her real struggles, however, were not so easily seen. Like many of her royal relatives, Marie Antoinette suffered from severe menstrual problems, repeated miscarriages, and what modern medicine would call hormonal imbalances, conditions likely rooted in her family's genetic history. Her marriage to Louis XVI was troubled from the beginning, though not in the scandalous way gossip suggested. Both partners bore their own inherited burdens. Louis showed signs of developmental delay and social awkwardness, making intimacy difficult. Marie battled anxiety and depression, common afflictions among Habsburg women. For 7 years, their marriage remained unconsummated, fueling malicious rumors. Court physicians examined Marie repeatedly, searching for a physical explanation, never realizing the deeper cause might lie in the couple's shared inbred heritage. When she finally became pregnant, her difficulties persisted. Severe morning sickness, anxiety attacks, and what we now recognize as prenatal depression plagued her first pregnancy. Her first child, Marie Therese, was born healthy, but later pregnancies ended in miscarriages or the deaths of infants, each loss deepening her despair. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette is not simply that she was swept away by the French Revolution, but that her genetic inheritance magnified her vulnerabilities at the worst possible moment. Her mood swings, oscillating between bursts of activity and periods of deep withdrawal, were ill-suited for the high-stakes politics of revolutionary France. Whether these patterns were purely circumstantial or symptoms of an inherited psychiatric tendency remains debated. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never uttered, reflects how political enemies weaponized her perceived aloofness. In truth, she was not callous, but overwhelmed, lacking the psychological resilience to cope with relentless crises. In her imprisonment and trial, she displayed remarkable composure, though observers noted moments of confusion, difficulty focusing, and emotional withdrawal, signs that echo the breakdowns suffered by other Habsburg women under extreme stress. When she was executed in 1793, it marked not just the fall of a queen, but the end of a genetic line that had shaped European history for centuries. To understand the Habsburg genetic tragedy, we must also look to Spain in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, to the daughters and granddaughters of Charles II. Charles himself was so inbred that his genetic coefficient, the measure of how closely related his parents were, was higher than that of a child born to a brother-sister pairing. He was impotent, epileptic, and possibly intellectually disabled, the culmination of 16 generations of dynastic inbreeding. His sisters and female cousins, the Infantas, arguably suffered more. They were expected to marry and produce heirs despite devastating health problems. Maria Margherita, born in 1651, showed severe developmental delays from early childhood, speaking only by age 7, struggling to walk, and displaying what today might be recognized as autism spectrum traits. Her sister, Maria Theresa, endured epilepsy, chronic respiratory illness, a severely malformed jaw that allowed her only liquid food, and a spinal curvature so extreme she needed constant support to sit upright. The Alcazar of Madrid, their residence, resembled a royal hospital more than a palace. Physicians, surgeons, and priests tended to children afflicted with epilepsy, deformities, immune disorders, and mental disabilities. Yet these women's fates were decided not by compassion, but by dynastic strategy. Medical reports on their conditions were circulated between courts, not to safeguard their health, but to judge their value as breeding stock. Maria Margherita was eventually married to her cousin Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, a man who had already been wed to another cousin, Margaret Theresa. The union was a disaster. Her cognitive delays and severe health issues made consummation nearly impossible, and she lived under the crushing psychological weight of knowing her worth was measured solely by her ability to produce children, something her body was ill-equipped to do. Royal letters from the period reveal the emotional toll, accounts of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants so malformed they could not survive beyond days or weeks. Without an understanding of genetics, these women blamed themselves, interpreting their suffering as divine punishment rather than the predictable result of inbreeding. When closely related individuals reproduce, their children have a higher chance of inheriting 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In genetically diverse populations, such harmful variants are masked by healthy copies from unrelated parents. But in the Habsburg dynasty, where cousins married cousins for centuries, harmful genes accumulated. This process, called inbreeding depression, affects not only physical traits, but also mental health, fertility, and immune function. The famous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, was the most visible sign. In some cases, it became so severe that descendants could not close their mouths or chew solid food. Yet the hidden consequences, epilepsy, intellectual disability, depression, anxiety, autoimmune disease, and infertility, were far more devastating. For the Habsburg women, these conditions meant lives marked by illness, repeated loss, and unrelenting political and personal pressure. Their suffering was not a matter of individual weakness, but the inevitable outcome of a dynasty trapped in its own genetic web.